So that's Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the elder son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The elder brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, has come home, you kill the fattened calf for him?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
Well, it's great to be with you again. If I can just plug one more time, our free magazine, got 300 copies of that, and if you sign up on the back, we're happy to post that to you as it comes out. Great if you're trying to get deeper into the scriptures. What I'm wanting to do in this session as we look at that passage that we just had read for us is give us all a sense of awe and wonder at Jesus, the best ever teacher. That is a 3-minute story, the like of which has never been told on this planet. It is simply the most phenomenal 3-minute story. It's Jesus' longest parable, and it's 388 words long. You know, the first 62% about the younger brother and the 38% about the older brother at the end. It's simply an amazing story. I don't know of any story that has so much packed in. And it works so powerfully because what we see is, as you look at the beginning of Luke 15, there are 4 groups of people listening, and we can really divide those groups into 2 groups of 2. On the one hand, we read in verses 1 and 2, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, and the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" And then he tells 3 stories. Parable of a lost sheep, 1 out of 100 sheep lost, then 1 out of 10 coins lost, then this parable of the 2 sons. So you've got tax collectors who you guess are interested in taking people's money and doing well out of themselves, happy to collaborate with the Romans. Sinners, well, in order to get that as like your identity, you have to be quite good at sin, like quite into it. And so, I mean, everyone sins, but, you know, to get sinner as like your label, you have to be going some. And that's where you've got that one group tax collectors and sinners, you don't expect to know the Bible very well. Then you've got the Pharisees. They're like the opposite of sinners. They are separatists. That's what Pharisee means. They did all the right things by society's rules and were trying to observe the Old Testament law. And then scribes, well, their job was to scribe, to write out. They would particularly spend their time writing out the Bible, but they might also write a contract for you if you needed to buy a field or whatever it is. But they're people who know the Bible really well. And one of the things that they did is they studied the scriptures really carefully to distinguish one phrase from another. So if you like, Jesus has got mixed audience. You might call it, in sometimes, a mixed ability group or mixed background group, because he's teaching people who might know nothing about the Bible, have no interest in it at all, and he's teaching people who know it professionally. Now, anyone who can speak to both those groups simultaneously is doing pretty well. And of course, that's what Jesus' story does, and it speaks to all of us in our situation. Because if you're running away from God, then you can really identify with that younger son who runs away and wastes things. And there's an amazing message about how God's willing to welcome you back. On the other hand, if you're one of those people who's like the older brother who seems to be hardworking at home but quite resentful, that would really relate to you if you're religious and seem to be doing the devout thing, but actually resenting God, and there's a call to you there. And Jesus tells these three stories in a row, and without being disrespectful about the first two, in some ways they're a warm-up act, because you have 1 out of 100 sheep lost by going away, and then there's joy when it's found. Then you have 1 out of 10 coins lost not going away, in the house, right? And there's joy when it's found. Then you have a son lost going away, and there's joy when he comes back. Then you have this son who's not gone away, and he seems resentful when the father comes and speaks to him, and then you have the missing ending. The missing ending of how does that older brother respond? And that's a really powerful thing, because that makes it an invitation and a challenge. If you're that older brother, how are you going to respond? But we know how Sudoku works. Sudoku works that you've got enough numbers, you can fill in the missing ending, can't you? We know there was joy when the coin was found at home. Therefore, we know if that older brother were to respond, there would be joy. And that's the power of telling these stories together. The story, the last story, the longest one, begins, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that's coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Notice that word. A lot of people miss that out. He's a fair father. He gives the property both to the younger son and to the older son who didn't ask for it. Now, you know what it's like. What country does it take place in? We're not told. It's a story. But if it takes place under Judaism, the oldest brother gets a double inheritance. And if you imagine it being like those, fairy tales about who gets the mill, the oldest brother gets the mill, right? So if you're thinking about if this is a farm and you're dividing it up, no, you don't keep chopping up the farm into smaller and smaller bits. In any country, the older brother does fantastically well. This older brother should be so grateful to the younger brother. He should say, bro, I am so grateful that you did the dirty work of asking Dad so I could get my inheritance early. Yippee, brother. If you ever want a favor in return, I'm happy to do it. He should be so glad, but of course he's not. The older brother now owns the farm. Every bit of work he's doing is building up his own farm. And Jesus tells this brilliant story. It's about a story about a younger son who goes away and wastes his property. By the way, Jesus' very next story, beginning in the next chapter, is about a steward, a manager who wastes the property. So you've got 2 stories about wasting money. Now, if you're a Pharisee, you really don't want to see money wasted. Taxpayers usually get pretty angry at the idea that government has wasted their money, and we'll get all self-righteous about that. Well, Jesus is telling a story about a waster. And there's a brilliance to the way Jesus tells the story, many aspects of it. One of them is it's completely the opposite to the way people retell this story. When people turn Jesus' story of the prodigal son into a novel, they spin out the whole novel about the bit where he goes and wastes the possessions. That's the big bit. Jesus does that all in one word, right? So he doesn't glamorize sin. That for them is the center of the novel, but you're never better off when you've heard a story of sin. Sometimes you need to hear a story of sin to sympathize with someone, but Jesus is too good a storyteller to make that the center of his story. And he's got lots of features in the story. Think about it, he's also got this famine. Now, do you notice the famine in the story? That's a striking element that a lot of people don't notice. Because we think that the reason the prodigal son got into trouble was because of his sin. But the way Jesus tells the story, he's the prodigal son and the unlucky son. Have you noticed that? He gets in. Why does he end up feeding pigs? Because he's made a whole load of bad choices, and because he was unlucky enough to choose the one country that a severe famine arose in. Now, people have done experiments with this story and actually seen how often people forget that there's a famine in this. So Jesus is actually slightly letting him off the hook, unlike his older brother, who will judge him as it's all because of him. So he's got this brilliant element in the story. The famine hits the one place that he's gone to, and so he ends up feeding pigs. And notice the way Jesus has details in the story which are really powerful. For instance, he tells you that the man hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country. Ouch. That just reminds you with one word how he's a foreigner, he's not a citizen. Or when he says they began to celebrate, he tells you how long the celebration's going on. Or when he says that the man, the older brother, was in the field, he doesn't tell you what he was doing, but we can all guess. Really good storyteller doesn't need to make everything explicit. They can leave stuff for your imagination. What about this? What's the very first word that comes from the older brother's mouth? Look, all these years I've been slaving for you. Do you know what's interesting about that? It's the missing word. What has been the first word from the younger brother's mouth each time he talks to his father? Father, can I have the share of the inheritance? Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. 3 times, twice in reality and once when he's rehearsing the speech in his head, the younger brother, who's gone a long way away, has called his father father. This older son, who's never gone away, who seems not to have gone astray, doesn't call him father. So the missing stuff in Jesus' story is amazing. You don't get a story like this by committee. You get a story like this by genius, and when every single word is passed down faithfully. And then we get this resentful thing from the younger brother, the older brother. You never gave me a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. Oh yeah, really? Been vegetarian on your own farm all these years, and you're blaming Dad? You know, what you can see in that is he's been able to eat meat all the time. He's been able to have friends around. It's his farm. But what's in this story is he wants to celebrate with his friends and not with his dad. So all those times that he's physically close to his dad, he actually wants to be able to get away for this puny celebration with a young goat rather than the fatted calf. He wants to be able to get away for that and away from his dad. So what you're seeing is that the one brother is far away physically, but far closer to his dad than the brother who is close physically, but wants to be away from his dad. So all of these things are just brilliant aspects of Jesus' storytelling. And to pack that all into 3 minutes, it's amazing. But Jesus has these people in his audience who are scribes. They are masters of the scriptures. Yeah, but they're not as much masters as the scriptures as Jesus. Jesus begins a story, a man had 2 sons. Who in the Old Testament had 2 and only 2 sons? There's one person particularly famous for having 2 and only 2 sons, and that would be Isaac. He has the older brother Esau, the younger brother Jacob, and remember how Jacob, the younger brother, tricked the older brother out of his inheritance. The older brother is therefore fuming mad, so fuming mad that the younger brother has to go off into a far country where he feeds animals. But he goes off with nothing and he comes back with everything. It's a different story. It's got a twist in it, Because, of course, in that story, it wasn't that the inheritance was divided. The story was this: the younger brother got everything. And then when you look at that story, you see how it's the older brother Esau who's out in the field. In fact, we're told how Jacob's a man who likes to live in tents, and it says Esau was a man of the field. And in that story, you remember how Esau one time has been out hunting, and he comes in starving, hungry, and says, "Here I am, starving of hunger." That's the phrase Jesus lifts out and puts into his story as with the younger brother. Here I am, starving of hunger. The only time people say is starving of hunger, yeah? And we see the link between the stories. But the dramatic high point of Jesus' story is this: the father runs, embraces, and kisses the younger son. There's only one place in the entire Bible that happens. It's the most surprising response in the entire Old Testament. Genesis 33 verse 4, when Jacob, who's cheated his older brother out of everything and has had to go off into a far country, is coming back. And he's heard that Esau is coming towards him with 400 men. And Esau ran, it says, Genesis 33 verse 4, to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Now, if you're a scribe, you know that verse because you count phrases. You know that there's only one time that happens. And it's when bad Esau forgave his brother who had cheated him out of everything. And it's the most surprising narrative turn of events in the entire Old Testament. There's a whole chapter beforehand just about how Jacob is taking security measures by splitting up his family into different groups so that when one lot gets splatted by Esau, the other lot might get away. So you were really not expecting this at all. But this is the really smart thing. Showing you some Greek, now I'm going to show you some Hebrew. One's from the British Library on the right and the other's from in St. Petersburg on the left. Every scribe in Jesus' day knew that verse, Genesis 33, super well, because it's one of the 15 sets of texts that they had to learn to put dots over. Can you see those 6 dots where that sort of teal arrow is? They're on the right. There's 6 dots there, and there are 6 dots there. Those are ones probably easier to see over the top of a word. Those are special scribal dots over the word "he kissed him," because there are some scribes didn't like the idea that Esau had actually kissed Jacob, and they had to put that over the top. That was part of the training. Jesus makes the dramatic high point of his story part of the scribal training that they all knew super well. Now, what's he doing? Jesus is telling a story where if you know absolutely no Bible background, it all works. You can take this story to any country, it's going to work. You don't need cultural background to understand the story. It's simple, right? But it also works at a really deep level. Because if you know the scriptures, you know Esau was cheated out of everything and he forgave his brother. So if you're a scribe or a Pharisee and you've got a problem with the fact that a tax collector can come to God quick, I mean, like, that tax collector might have ripped you out of some money, so you don't want them to be able to get a fast track to God, do you? Just be able to approach Jesus and get to God. You want them to stay outside. You want to say, stay outside. We're on the inside track. We're Pharisees. We're scribes. We're doing the right stuff. I mean, if sinners can just get straight to God, well, you could sin, and then just get a ticket to heaven. No, not having it. You've got to keep the rules. You've got to study the scriptures. You've got to, look, those tax collectors are collaborating with the Romans. They're ripping us out. They're giving money which support the Roman army to oppress us. Really? No, they can't come to God. And what Jesus does, he tells this really powerful story. Even bad old Esau forgave his brother. There are so many more connections. A man had 2 sons. Esau out in the field. Someone saying they're hungry, cheating out the inheritance. Young goats. There's only one other time that people have young goats as a meal in the Bible. When is it? It's when Jacob, wearing the robe of his older brother, tricks his blind father, the father who can't see a long way off, that he's his older brother. And it all comes together there in this amazing story. If you're a scribe, you knew that story of Jacob tricking his blind father, and how many times it says, draw near, draw near, draw near. That's what the older brother, it says, does. So, what a contrast. Esau, who stays at home, and we're told he's waiting for his father to die, but he forgave his little brother. But it's not just that Jesus tells a story which has got this Old Testament story in the background. There's a lot more. It's not just the story of Jacob and Esau, it's the story of Jacob and Laban. Think about this. Who said, all these years I've slaved for you? Oh, that's in red. That would be when Jacob says that to Laban. Now, Laban's his father-in-law, and he's gone off and worked for his father-in-law for all these years, and Jesus takes phrases from that story and he builds them into his story and reverses them and all sorts of things. And the point is this: Laban lost lots and lots of his flock to Jacob that God had chosen to bless. And Laban had to accept that. So there's a moral to that story. But it's not just that story. It's the story of Joseph. You thought about this. In Jesus' story, it suddenly put a ring and a robe on his hand. Where else in the Bible does anyone suddenly get a ring and a robe? Where's the only other sudden, permanent, rags to riches story in the Bible? That would be Joseph coming out of prison, wouldn't it? Oh yeah. And whereas no one gave the prodigal any food, Joseph feeds everyone. So you get these reversals going on. You see what's going on? The layers you have with this story. There's only one other place you get a ring and a robe like that. Scribes would have known that. But think about it. Joseph forgave his brothers so much, didn't he? His brothers had tried to kill him. They'd sold him, everything like that. And he overcame that and forgave them. Did his brothers deserve to be forgiven? No, not at all. Do the tax collectors and sinners deserve to be forgiven? No, not at all. Have they offended against you? Well, they've offended against you by taking your money a lot less than Joseph's brothers sinned against him. But he forgave his brothers. Oh, there's a bit more though, isn't it? Because, of course, Joseph is the only other son that the father thought was dead and is alive again. Remember that? That's what it says in this story. My son was dead and is alive again. He's lost and is found. That's basically what Jacob said when he hears Joseph's alive. My son was dead. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I'm going to go and see him. So you see how time and time again Jesus is using these stories from Genesis. There's a little bit more. You see, the older brother bursts out, doesn't he? And he says, you never gave me a young goat so that I could eat with my friends. But when this son of yours, oh, that's a beautiful phrase, isn't it? Son of yours, not brother of mine. You know, all those sort of subtleties in the story that you've got. When this son of yours who devoured your property with prostitutes came, you killed the fatted calf for him. Well, it wasn't for him. Actually, everyone gets to eat it. Now, older brother, have you spoken to younger brother yet? No. How do you know his most significant expense has been prostitutes? Has he been sending back postcards from the brothel? I mean, like, how do you know that? You just in from the field, right? How does he know that? What is the one possible source of information for that? One, it's his imagination. And why is he imagining his brother there? You know? What's on his heart? Interesting. But there's a bit more. You see, those words, friend, goat, and prostitute, you're a scribe. You've come across those before, haven't you? There's only one place in the Bible where you get friend, goat, and prostitute together, isn't there? And that is Judah and Tamar. That wonderful story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis chapter 38, where, again, within 2 verses, you get exactly that. Now, what's the story of Judah and Tamar? I'll give you the brief version, okay? The brief version is like this. While Joseph is out in a foreign country, the younger brother, sexually behaving and resisting Mrs. Potiphar, Judah, from whom the Jews derived their name, that every scribe would say they're descended from, is sexually misbehaving, right? That's basically the story going on. And so there's a little bit here in Jesus' story for those who have ears to hear it. Now, did the scribes see all these references? Maybe they didn't. Maybe they were just really unimpressed with Jesus' story because it could just float over you and think, well, that's not a very impressive story. But come Judgment Day, you see that a genius has been in front of you and has worked out a story which is less than 3 minutes long, which has all of this richness of reference to the book of Genesis. It's amazing. But there's a little bit more, isn't there? Because of course we know it's the story of Abraham as well. Because a man had two sons. When you say a man had two sons, that doesn't just trigger Isaac and Jacob, Esau and Jacob, does it? You often think, yeah, there's like, Ishmael and Isaac. And of course, Abraham had some more sons later. But that's pretty contrasting, isn't it? And of course, he is the archetypal father, the father figure we have in this parable. Oh, and of course, he's the guy who begins his speech with quick. Remember that passage we read in the earlier session? What's he say to Sarah when the guests come along? Quick. Now, if you're a scribe, you know this is the first time you copy the word quick in the Bible. The first person to say the word quick. Quick, leading to 3 seahs of fine flour, which goes into Jesus' shortest parable, right? Then rushing off and getting the fatted calf. Oh, and it's the only other old man in the Bible who runs. Don't you think the scribes had noticed that Abraham was 99 when he's running? So it's all there. Abraham, the amazing father who welcomes. And there's a message to the scribe. Be like Abraham, who put on amazing hospitality for people he didn't know. People who turned up randomly, as it says in the book of Hebrews. People have entertained angels unawares. Look at all of these. If you're a scribe, it's the first time someone runs, Genesis 18. First hospitality, first quick, first fatted calf. They're all there, and they're all in Jesus' story. They know it. It's amazing. And we know Jesus is thinking about 3 seahs of fine flour. By the way, this all comes together as a wonderful evidence that Jesus told this story. The early church didn't generally use parables. The parables all go back to Jesus, and they've been handed down with integrity. It's not that we just got some of the words from Jesus and some from a committee that helped improve his work. That doesn't explain it. Fundamentally, every phrase is coming from Jesus, reliably handed down. Now, how it gets reliably handed down, we can discuss, but it is reliably handed down. It's amazing. Jesus is the most amazing storyteller. We've already looked at the 3 seahs of flour, and of course, Abraham is the only other father to give away his inheritance while he's still alive. Remember that. Genesis 25. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. He didn't give any to Ishmael, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to an east country. Everyone would have known that if they were a scribe. Now, why does he not give the inheritance to Ishmael? You want to know? Genesis 21. Because Ishmael despised the feast for the younger brother. There's a time when Abraham's having a feast for Isaac's weaning. And it says this, that there is Ishmael laughing. And and Sarah says to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. He lost the inheritance through despising the younger brother. And by the way, that's a message to scribes. If you don't think the tax collectors and sinners can come into the kingdom, you lose your inheritance. Don't think you can have your access to God and not welcome others in. And that's a message to us in churches, isn't it? We can't have our self-righteous huddles in churches and think, as people come in from whatever background it is, no, you've got to do time, probate, we're not going to trust you, we're not going to accept you, you're on the outside. If you want to act like that, you actually lose your own inheritance. It is an imperative that if you're trying to claim that you are a child of Abraham, that you accept other children of his. Well, of course, Abraham wouldn't let his son go into a far country, would he? Oh, let's go another story. It's the story of Cain and Abel. Let's just complete off Genesis, right? A man had two sons. Adam, yeah, he had two sons. Yeah, had some more later, but he had two sons. The Bible's first conflict, family conflict, is an older brother envious of the acceptance of a younger brother. The older brother associated with a field. He gets very angry. Bible's first recorded envy. And God, the father figure, going out and pleading with Cain. Wow. All of Genesis' greatest hits rolled into one story, so you're getting clear references, as well as oblique references, right the way through. They're happening all the time. And yet, you don't need to have read Genesis to make sense of the story. So Jesus doesn't use footnotes. He speaks to simple language. There's nothing other than simple language here. And yet there's depth that we can drown in. It's just huge. That's the best teacher. All of these people had so much reason for anger. Esau, Laban, Joseph. They had to forgive, or at least have peace with God's plan. Ishmael despises the younger brother. He lost everything. So many lessons for the scribes to learn. Many more. I won't dwell on them. Well, what can we say? This story is amazing. Could talk about it for a very long time. That's because we have the most amazing teacher, Jesus Christ. And we need to make him the practical teacher for our lives. We need to say, Jesus, you are Lord. What do you have to teach me? We need to listen to his word. We need to expect depths in. And it's almost as if Genesis is written, that book of over 3 hours long, to make the material for this 3-minute story. But hey, how can that happen? Well, if Jesus is God and God wrote Genesis, that's how it can happen. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. All things were made through him, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is the most amazing teacher, and we need to bow the knee because we really have his teachings handed down to us. There's nothing more profound, there's nothing more simple, there's nothing more morally challenging. And he lived by his teaching. And he paid the price so that we could be accepted. You feel like an outcast, a tax collector, and a sinner today? You're welcome. Come to Christ. You're feeling self-righteous and an insider, Pharisee, scribe. You need to bow the knee. And you need to accept others into the body of Christ. You need to bow and come before him. You need to realize that none of our righteousness gets us to Christ. None of our cleverness gets us to Christ. Some of those scribes must have felt quite clever. But they were in front of one who knew a lot more. The one who made language, the one who made the world, the one who made them. That's who Christ is. We need to bow in worship before him. Let's just pray. Lord, thank you for your word. And thank you that you didn't just give us books about yourself, but that you came in person into the world, in flesh into the world to show us who you are. And we thank you that Jesus Christ does that. We thank you that he's perfect, that he welcomes sinners. We ask for us that you will help us to worship you aright, see you as you are, and adore you. For your glory. Amen.